there's the view out my window.
Nice.
It's still under construction. There's still areas that are open, and there are a lot of.
Now you're supposed to. Well, that's fine. Just keep doing that, Les.
Okay, I'm there's Korea right there.
Right, we're in Korea, friends.
It looks better than me, actually. So
that's good. Now this is Seoul, Korea, right? And what are we seeing?
This is actually it's called Songdo. Songdo, it's a smart city. It's actually built on landfill over the ocean, and which sometimes makes me a little nervous. I'm not sure that it's supposed to support all of these tall buildings.
Okay, now you got to pan around a little bit because you had another angle there for a minute.
Yeah,
so
I should have stayed in my apartment, because from my apartment you can see the mountains on one side and then the ocean on the other. But here I'm only on 7th floor. In my apartment, I'm on 15th floor.
So this is your office. Okay.
This is my office. This is George Mason, Korea.
I see. Okay. Great. Well, thank you. Now you can turn it back onto your own face, and I will introduce you.
Okay.
Looks like we see your
I'm trying. There we go.
All right.
There we go.
That's Les Kurtz, friends. And I'm Metta Spencer, and the other guy with the blue shirt and beard and thinning hair is John Feffer. Actually, by golly, you all have blue shirts on. So, I don't know how I'm going to introduce you except to say John Feffer is a guy he's coming in to us from Washington, D.C., I presume. Isn't that where you are, John?
Correct. Mm-hmm.
John is somebody I used to run into a lot in Eastern Europe back in the 80s. I'm not going to try to give you a complete list. Somebody I used to run it. What? I don't know what you're saying, but anyway, John Feffer is the editor of Foreign Policy in Focus, which is part of the Institute for Policy Studies at Washington, D.C., which is a pretty good outfit from my point of view. And we have, you've already had a glimpse of Seoul and Lester Kurtz, who is a professor of sociology at George Mason University and is spending the year in Seoul, South Korea. He's a peace studies guy who I saw a picture of, looks like a drawing of Gandhi behind you on the wall. So that's a pretty good indication of what you do. And finally, I get to introduce Marius Grinius. And Marius is a former Canadian ambassador to South and North Korea. And he's also been the Canadian ambassador for Disarmament, posted in Geneva, where all the good things go on, and has been more or less retired, but he certainly keeps his hand in a number of things. And so when I heard that we needed to cover something about North and South Korea, I thought of Marius immediately, and he's kind enough to give us some of his time. So we've been struggling with our equipment here, and I really don't have a list of things to talk about, but let me start. Where shall I start? And what shall I ask you? Marius, why don't you get us started by giving us your take on this historic meeting that took place in Singapore a few days ago?
Well, thanks, Metta, and I'm delighted to join you and meet John and Lester on top. It's been a crazy up and down zigzag all over the place. I've counted with President Moon going to see Putin in Moscow this Thursday. We've been up to 10 summits with respect to North Korea. And that includes, of course, two Xi Jinping with Kim Jong-un, or Kim 3, and also two with Moon, and of course all kind of working up to this frenzied thing in this show that we've had in Singapore, where we have this joint statement, and it's very short. It's actually a lot of the language is what we've heard before, even going back to a declaration of 1992 that talked about the declaration, denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Anyway, so you've got this joint statement. The two leaders, I think, declared victory. We still don't know what Trump and Kim Jong-un actually talked when they were talking in private before the bigger meeting. There are so-called commitments, including North Korea's commitment to complete denuclearization. But now the hard part begins from my point of view. First of all, Pompeo and his counterpart, probably Kim Yong-chol, are supposed to sit down and actually negotiate the denuclearization, except that we don't really know if they have a mutual understanding of what that actually means. And they're going to go into all the nitty-gritty of things that have failed in the past, including scope, what's actually on the table, what the timelines are. The Americans, of course, have said we're going to front-end load this, complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization. I suspect the North Koreans have something quite different in mind, including the kind of the step-by-step, let's see what happens. And of course, the big thing of verification. Later, I'm sure we'll talk about UN sanctions, CW, BW, what these security assurances are. There's a whole bunch of stuff, including Kang Kyung-hwa, the South Korea's foreign minister, saying today in the Korea Herald that she's looking to some sort of peace agreement, but by the end of the year, I think, or earlier, if possible.
Transforming the ceasefire into a real peace. Is that what she's referring to?
Well, we actually don't know because some sort of peace declaration, possibly a peace treaty, peace agreement. Who's going to sign it? As with the big question of denuclearization, there's a heck of a lot of questions out there in terms of what exactly it means and how people will go forward. But those are the big things that are out there.
Okay. Well, you know what I'm curious about, Les, right off the top, is how the people in Seoul feel about all this.
Yeah, well, I knew that you would ask that question, and I couldn't really answer it, but because I have to give kind of a caveat. You know, I'm living in kind of a small circle here. I haven't done any broad research. You know, I was trying to find some polls, and I didn't find any opinion polls on this matter. The people I talk with, which is, you know, it's mostly academics, professors, staff people at the university, some people in the community. My family actually attends an international church here, a United Methodist Church that has a number of Koreans in the congregation, and I've spoken with several of them, and also the pastor of the church whose parents were from North Korea. And in fact, one of the things that I've found, there's a lot of, cautious optimism, I guess is what I would say from almost everybody I've talked to around here is much more positive. There's a lot of positive emotion around the summit, and less of the sort of cynicism that I've read in many of the newspapers, including even to some extent the Korea Times, which arrives here at the university on a daily basis. So I've been trying to follow some of that, although I still don't quite know yet how to evaluate the Korea Times. I'm not sure exactly what their position is on all of these issues. But I've found a lot of emotion and positive optimism that's sort of stepping back from the brink. And given all of my caveats, I'd say that's what I see here.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Does that surprise either of the other guys?
No, I think the less has tapped into pretty much the general feeling in South Korea. The polling I've seen suggests that a distinct majority thought that the Singapore summit was a success, about 66% according to a Gallup poll. Only 11% thought it was a failure. And Moon Jae-in's popularity rating remains pretty high, close to 80%, even up a little bit after the summit. So I think the reactions in Korea are in some sense sharply different from the reactions here in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, everything I read is, U.S. and Canadian, I guess, as well, pretty skeptical about whether Trump got anything out of the deal. I would say that's the most common reaction I get is seeing people say, well, he got taken, that Kim was the one who scored all the points. Would you say that's true, Marius, in among diplomats?
Well, certainly there is that. Diplomats are good at keeping score and looking at nuances and all of that kind of stuff. But I think we have to have that kind of healthy skepticism. But there's considerable hope that something has changed. I give it to Trump, not exactly my favorite guy, but I do say that he's the guy who said, okay, my previous presidents have not been able to stop North Korea's development, so I'm going to try something different. And even some of the shots out of Singapore, you've got this Kim Jong-un kind of looking at Trump, trying to figure him out. And I think there's a lot of that going on. I just hope that they get on with the negotiations and really truly get on with trying to see if Kim Jong-un is actually going to be ready to negotiate away his nuclear weapons, which have seemed to be really shall we say, trump card in terms of what guarantees his regime survival. So as I've said, the work is now has to start pretty soon, and we've got to see how things are going to go, and I hope in a very positive way.
Well, I'm glad to hear the hope. I keep thinking, the whole procedure has, from my point of view as somebody really wanting nuclear disarmament, has validated the value of having a nuclear arsenal. My goodness, did he get away with those little toys, I mean, that's all you need. Anything. Sorry, but that unfortunately, I think that's the message that will be taken from that.
It's certainly the message that Iran is taking, I think. It had an agreement with the United States and several other parties to freeze its nuclear weapons program, which frankly didn't exist or hadn't existed since roughly 2003. Now it's been abrogated basically by the United States, which is withdrawn. So what is Iran's takeaway from the Singapore summit? Well, the country that has developed nuclear weapons obviously gets star treatment, whereas we've gotten the bum rush from the president. And so I think that's a very dangerous
Libya, too. That's another, pretty conclusive evidence. Don't give them away or you'll wind up in a ditch someplace. No.
But I would add that while I agree with Marius that the hard work is definitely ahead of us, I wouldn't put so much emphasis on denuclearization, in part because of the difficulties of imagining North Korea, at least in the short term, giving up its nuclear weapons. For me, the most important element of all of this has nothing to do with the United States and Trump's demands. The most important thing is interKorean cooperation. The kinds of steps that the two Koreas have taken in the two summits so far exceed in detail and imagination, frankly, anything that Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un discussed. So as far as I'm concerned, let the United States and North Korea have discussions all they want for the next 2.5 odd years, that this process will continue. There will be arguments, there will be disagreements, perhaps there'll be some slow incremental progress. I don't expect CVID to happen, but I do expect there to be space opened up for the two Koreas to move further in terms of economic and political cooperation. Of course, that will require, especially on the economic side, some lessening of economic sanctions, or else the two Koreas frankly will not be able to have the kind of cooperation they have talked about.
Okay.
May I add?
Yeah.
May I pick up on that?
Yeah.
I'm glad that John brought that up, because this is sort of what I've felt here in Korea as well. That this is what's really exciting is the fact that the two Koreas have made so much progress. And here we also have Trump to thank, because there's a sense in which, and I don't think this is just on the Korean peninsula, but in other parts of the world, that because Trump is so disrespected and has been in a way, he's kind of sidelined the United States in much of the discussion. And so what I think in a way, both President Moon and President Kim have sort of seized the opportunity in this regard. And I mean, I think President Moon is as John pointed out, very popular here in South Korea, and especially among progressive circles. He was a human rights lawyer. He was a student activist. In fact, from what I understand, part of his career trajectory was he wasn't able to become a judge or some kind of official administrator, magistrate, because of his student activism. And so he went into private law practice and practiced human rights law. And he's been quite a reformer. I mean, a number of things that he's done. And I think that what's really exciting, the people I talk to here, is this opening up. Someone told me that they cried when the two Korean presidents met, and in some ways, maybe that summit was just as important as the summit between President Trump and President Kim.
If I could add to that, I certainly agree with what John and Lester have said. Moon Jae-in is the direct descendant, if you like, of Kim Dae-jung and of No Moo-hwin, both of whom I had the privilege of meeting during my time there. And so it's sunshine policy, it's positive, but I do hope that Moon has also learned that you can't just go from that last embrace between Kim and Moon. Maybe the dynamism is there, but there are some other elements, and one that I checked out, which I believe is pretty important, is that the Panmunjom Declaration says, and that one that I checked out, which I believe is pretty important, is that the
Oh.
Sorry. I was my my computer came on and suddenly we're getting the volume from there, so I got it muted. Sorry.
Okay. The Panmunjom Declaration says that all other previous agreements are in place, okay, between North and South Korea, including the two declarations, one by Kim Dae-jung and then later by Roh Moo-hyun. But if you read the Roh Moo-hyun Kim Jong Il Declaration, there's a very clear line in it that they will not interfere with the internal aspects of each country, okay? And that's a signal for South Korea not to criticize North Korea's egregious human rights record. You know, there's still up to 120,000 political prisoners. But you know, there are these sort of interKorean issues that are going to have to be sorted out. And the Red Cross reunions is another big one because North Korea, of course, played that game really, really well, charging for every visit and what have you. There's a heck of a lot of money that was involved there. The sad part was that when after the families meet and you've seen the tearful goodbyes, very emotional, but technically after that, according to my minders, when I've visited Pyongyang, technically after that, they could not be in any communication with the families in the South. So that communication, you know, you call it family reunions, but it's, hey, a kind of a one-off rather than a continuation. I suspect that's breaking down with more information and more memory sticks seeping into North Korea, which I think is the greatest thing that's happening there. But again, there are dark sides there that one have to be careful of.
Yeah, I'd like to add that all of that is true, and we won't expect human rights to come up in the conversation with Donald Trump in the lead, since he's demonstrated his indifference to human rights pretty much anywhere in the world, with one or two exceptions. But I would note that one thing that has changed in the last decade or so, certainly since I was last in North Korea, has been remittances. In other words, there's approximately 30,000 North Koreans living in South Korea, some of whom are sending money back to their families in North Korea, which, if you think about it, is actually quite an extraordinary transformation. In other words, there used to be very little information going back and forth between North and South Korea. But with the breakdown of basically the government economy in the 1990s during the famine period, and the rise of the market economy, and the rise of other things like corruption widespread within North Korea, there's been what was an impermeable membrane has become a semi-permeable membrane. In other words, you have both money going to North Korea from North Koreans in the South, but you also have information coming from both South Korea and, of course, from primarily from China. So the notion of North Korea as an entirely isolated country, now, if we're talking relative, of course, North Korea is relatively much more isolated than most other countries in the world, but the image of it as being completely isolated has changed over the last 10 to 20 years. And the remittances in particular are, and this is an interesting point, an indication of confidence in the North Korean economy. In other words, if North Koreans in South Korea are sending money back to their families in North Korea, and the money is going largely to start businesses, small-scale businesses, they have confidence that the North Korean economy will continue and that the government won't crack down on those businesses. If there is a change in that remittance flow, in other words, if the North Koreans in South Korea stop sending back that money and instead arrange for their families to leave North Korea, that is perhaps the first sign that that there is a loss of confidence both in the government's economic reforms, but also in the ability of the North Korean economy to make any kind of advances.
Marius, how much confidence would you put in North Korea's reforms? Maybe that's too strong a word. Whatever word you would use instead of reforms.
Well, for the first point, as John has said, there's the government, the socialist dream has been breaking down because they couldn't feed their own people. That's why in the 90s you had massive starvation, and so suddenly things are changing, and people are have to fend for themselves, and they're doing it rather well. I mean, I'm sure we've all seen the some of the markets, the so-called private markets in Pyongyang, and I'm sure elsewhere, that seem to be, working reasonably well. Lots of Chinese goods coming through, all of that. What I find, I had two postings to Vietnam. I opened up our mission in Hanoi in the early 90s and came back as ambassador in the late 90s. And my first trip to Pyongyang, I had this sense of flashback with all the uniforms and the kind of distrust of foreigners and what have you. But slowly over I had the privilege of 4 longish trips there, mostly by train, by the way, to see that there were changes, just like I saw during my time back and forth from Bangkok to Hanoi before moving to Hanoi, and then seeing the changes. So again, people want a better life for their children, and they're going to move forward on that. The question, of course, is so what do you, these socialist characteristics in a place that is more Stalinist than Stalin, I would say. So, and of course, Kim Jong-un seems to be ready to do that economic leap because he's confident in his nuclear weapons. So it's an interesting dynamic, and hopefully a peaceful one.
Would you say that he is diminishing at all the cult of they used to call it cult of personality. I saw somebody else recently on TV, a woman saying that it was the family created a religion around themselves as sort of godlike figures, and certainly all these images that one used to see, like when Kim Jong-un or Il died, there were all these hysterical people up and down the street and so on. To what extent is that real? Do they worship this guy or the family, or is this totally fabricated just to? I saw that one guy said that somebody lost his life because he didn't clap hard enough for I think it was a member of the family. I guess I'm wondering how much do they really believe that they have this marvelous leadership, and to what extent is it they're saving their hides by pretending?
Well, I would say that certainly there was a great deal of affection for Kim Il-sung, and the way you can measure that is simply, the comments that North Korean defectors had when he died in 1994. Many North Korean defectors in South Korea, who of course there was no reason for them to lie about their feelings, said, I left the country, I was unhappy about being there, but I genuinely am sorry about the death of Kim Il-sung. Now, it's not like Kim Il-sung was a beneficent leader. I mean, he executed thousands of people in purges in the late 1940s and 1950s. He was an extraordinary, ruthless character. However, he did, as you say, built up a personality cult that was much influenced by the Christianity that is through his mother's side, and the fact that Christianity was extraordinarily strong in North Korea prior to the communist takeover. Pyongyang, known as the Jerusalem of the East, and the Kim Il-sung very consciously patterned, the personality cult on the father, the Virgin Mary, and the son. Kim Jong-il's mother, who died rather young, and Kim Jong-il himself. So you had this kind of triangular foundation for this personality cult built on Christian roots. And it had extraordinary, I think, influence on people's lives, people's belief systems in a formally atheist country. Kim Jong-il, his son, almost everyone says that he was not nearly as popular. One could say, frankly, an unpopular leader, someone who was clearly not fit to run a country. He himself was reticent about taking over the leadership. I think he much would have preferred being a film director than the leader of a country, someone who made one public speech in his entire lifetime, and it consisted of less than a dozen words. He was completely uncharismatic as compared to his father. So when he died, I don't think you didn't see anything like the outpouring of emotion that accompanied his father's death in 1994. The Kim Jong-un, of course, has done as much as he can to pattern himself not on his father, but on his grandfather, to even look as much like his grandfather as possible, same haircut, same kind of dress, same portly stature, same on-the-spot guidance. And whether he has, I don't think he has revived or has continued the personality cult to quite the same degree as Kim Il-sung. I don't think that's possible in the country any longer. But he certainly is at least tried at a formal level to inspire the same kind of charismatic reaction from the population.
Mm-hmm. Okay. When I think of dealing with somebody whose human rights record is so atrocious, I have very confused feelings about what to do, in negotiating, or even, would you even want to shake hands with the guy, and part of me is kind of a hawk, because I just don't feel good about cozying up to somebody who's such a monster. So set me straight, folks. What should we peace people do or feel about Kim Jong-un?
I think Les has to unmute his...
Unmute Les, yeah.
I was making noise. There, I muted my, because I was making too much noise, so I was muting my my microphones. Thank you. Actually, I'm looking forward to reading John's books. This ambivalence is really important to acknowledge, I think. And as I've thought about this, I mean, I have the same kind of ambivalence as Metta. But how do you do? But of course, it's only when we can deal with the enemy that we can make progress toward peace. And there are a couple of things I've thought about. One from Gandhi and one from the Rand Corporation. Very different sources that have some similar insights. What Gandhi tried to do was he said, separate the deed from the doer. You have respect for your adversary as a human being, and you can separate that from the actions that they're engaged in that you deplore. So I think that's sort of a first step for you don't respect the actions, but you do respect the person as a human being, which makes it possible to reach out to people whose behavior you don't like. The second thing is in terms of what brings about actual change. And I must admit, I'm kind of a congenital optimist here. But there was a study by Seth Jones of why terrorist groups end, and it was published by the Rand Corporation a number of years ago. It was actually about lessons for dealing with Al Qaeda, and they had a huge database of terrorist groups over 100 years, I think it was, and looking at the ones that stopped existing, and it turns out that the largest number of terrorist groups that ended did so because they were brought to the table. There was some political solution that included them in the governing process. And in fact, military intervention had almost no effect on ending terrorist groups. There were a number of them that were ended because of police action, like the arrest and jailing of leadership, that sort of thing. But the largest number of them came from bringing people to the table. And I'm wondering if there's some similar lesson here for dealing with someone like President Kim, that if we can see him as a human being, look for the positive possibilities, encourage his positive behavior, and find some way of including him in the conversations, that this is a more effective as well as hopeful way of dealing with this kind of situation.
Can you protect any of his victims in that way? It always feels to me like, you're welcoming him in, come on in, be our friend. And that means I don't care anything about those guys you're killing. I don't know.
Well, I have the same ambivalence you do, Metta, and especially coming out of the Eastern European context where we were working with, human rights activists, and we saw, the importance of solidarity with human rights activists in Eastern Europe during the communist period, and how that, it made a difference in the lives of those people and throughout those societies. Unfortunately, the situation with North Korea is very different. In other words, there are no human rights defenders within the country. There aren't even any individuals like Andrei Sakharov who could, be the conscience of the nation, so to speak. Mm. So we don't have any interlocutors inside North Korea. The civil society in general does not exist within North Korea, except in some very, very minor ways. So for instance, and I'll give you one example of how engagement with North Korea has advanced the human rights conversation a little bit in ways that the name and shame approach has had difficulties achieving progress, and that's with disability rights. So for years, the UN Special Rapporteurs on Human Rights in North Korea tried to get into North Korea to do their reports, and they had to issue their reports without actually having ever visited the country. One UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights finally was able to go last year, and that was the Rapporteur on Disability Rights. And she visited North Korea, and she not only met with the government, but she actually met with what is, one could say, perhaps stretching the definition a little bit, fledgling civil society. In other words, there are groups of disabled within North Korea who are organizing themselves outside, in some sense, of the government. And what they're doing is they're organizing income generation activities, because that, of course, is the most important thing at the moment. As Marius was saying, that it is increasingly a market society, and that's the only way you can survive. And disabled in general, previously in North Korea, were at the bottom of the barrel in terms of their access to jobs, unless they'd been injured in the Korean War in special circumstances. But generally speaking, the disabled were not accorded very many rights whatsoever in society. But now, in part because of cooperation with Handicapped International and other disability organizations around the world, disabled are organizing themselves. There's an extraordinary change within the society, and you see at an official governmental level the government signing the UN, basically the agreement on disabilities, one of the several human rights accords that it has signed, and making a little progress even at that level. So there, again, in contrast to Eastern Europe, where outsiders partnered with civil society, in the absence of civil society, there still is an opportunity for engagement strategies, I think, to be successful at the human rights level.
Mm-hmm. Marius, tell me how much effort there was or concern there was when you were doing diplomacy in that part of the world to help people insofar as you could. I presume you really couldn't do much, but was there any real policy to try to do what you could to give support or help to victims of, North Korean gulag, if you will?
It was fascinating. I was there 2005, 2007, and the United Nations was there. They were North Korea was still coming out of huge famine. When I visited the military side on the North Korean demilitarized zone, some of the soldiers actually were not much bigger than their AK-47s, not much taller than their AK-47s. You could see how famine had affected the population, and even now, the United Nations is saying we have a nutritional challenge. What was working was they actually had a number of NGOs doing good humanitarian work alongside the World Food Program, UNICEF, especially those two organizations, and things were looking pretty good. This, of course, was the time of the kind of the follow-up to Sunshine Policy. So food in the form of rice was coming from the United Nations via the United Nations, but also directly from South Korea and China. So again, it was a difficult time, but things were moving. What happened, though, was most NGOs were kicked out of the country. And it was a bit what I saw in Vietnam a decade earlier, where the government, the North Korean government, was suddenly rather suspicious of these foreigners, and kind of considering them to be, many of them to be spies, saboteurs, you name it. The suspicions were there. So North Korea, from a humanitarian point of view, kind of dipped in a negative sense, and even now I don't think is doing as well from that point of view. But economically, when I see YouTube shots of at least of Pyongyang, you see those new buildings, everything that is being built by Kim for the nomenclatura. And certainly he wants to keep the military on side. He has enough confidence now that he has been able to go and visit his new best friend Xi Jinping twice now in China. And of course, you have the Singapore summit. So he's feeling probably a little bit more comfortable in terms of the people he trusts to make sure nothing happens. There's no coup d'etat or anything like that. So is that a positive thing or a negative thing? Well, one can argue, I suppose, both sides. But again, just the fact that Kim has had a walkabout in Singapore, and it was filmed apparently by KCNA and shown in North Korea, it's a bit of an eye opener. So it's a good thing.
Mm-hmm. How do they? This is a funny question, but you see Trump and Kim walking along, talking to each other. Surely, no, Kim doesn't speak English, does he? How do they have earphones, translators, or something? Because I was puzzled by how they managed to seem to have a real conversation. Do you know what's going on there? I really don't know the technology.
Well, they had two translators. I mean, when they had their meeting, their private meeting for about a half an hour, and you probably read that Trump showed Kim a video that had been prepared by basically the National Security Council, and that had Korean subtitles. So there were a number of different mechanisms, I guess, for mediating between the two of them. But, honestly, what does Donald Trump say that's of any value that needs to be translated? I mean, the man himself said that, he gets a sense of a person in 10 seconds. I mean, it's not through, he doesn't, listen to what Kim Jong-un says.
Unfortunately, I get a sense of him too.
So, I mean, for Donald Trump, everything is gut instinct. And I think he also conveys his own character through nonverbal means as well, through his size, through his, he's either smiling or he's not smiling. He's either shaking your hand with great determination, as he did with Emmanuel Macron. He is someone who is, I mean, the word diplomacy is not actually, I think, the right word to use for Donald Trump and what he does on the international stage. It's really theatrical in its effects, not diplomatic or political.
Well, in fact, that is one. I'm sorry, Marius. Beg your pardon.
Just if I could add, I noted that when Xi Jinping went to Florida. Here's Trump babbling away, if you like, as they're walking through the lovely gardens and what have you. And then there was a certain moment also with Kim Jong-un. What I think happens is both the Chinese handlers and the North Korean handlers kind of say, listen, just look at him, nod every so often, smile. If you laugh and carry on, shut up, don't do anything else. Just look stately. And we'll get through this and we'll get the translator back to help you out.
Okay. Okay. Les, you seem overwhelmed by enjoying this situation. I hear that too.
Yeah, that's wonderful. One other thing I wanted to bring up, we were talking about the economics of North Korea, but another issue that's emerged here was the couple of conversations I've had. Including one as a vice president of a company here, American vice president of a Korean company that makes machines that do automated car assembly. And he was pointing out the economic benefit to South Korea of improved relationships with the North. And part of it has to do with just opening up the Korean peninsula. We're isolated down here. We were even talking about wanting to buy a car. We said, well, let's go to Hong Kong, buy a car, and drive it to the North Korean border, and then get our South African friend who can drive in North Korea to drive the car through North Korea, and we can pick it up again in South Korea. So if you think of South Korea at the end of this peninsula, basically cut off from land routes that could be opened up, by rail and so on, to China, and then even I guess even Russia. Vladivostok is just down the road or down the rail. So there are a number of economic benefits, I think, that some South Koreans are seeing to opening up also cheap labor for South Korean businesses to hire North Koreans and that sort of thing.
Not just cheap labor, but, and this of course is the great irony of working with North Korea, but non-unionized labor. South Korean labor unions are some of the feistiest, shall we say, in the world. And I knew a guy who would give these presentations on attracting international capital to North Korea, investors from Europe and elsewhere. And the first slide he would show would be of striking South Korean workers. And then he would say, you can get the best Korean workers without the strikes by investing in North Korea. And, this, again, the irony of working in a communist state and having access to both cheaper labor and labor that is essentially captive. Although the experience at the Kaesong Industrial Complex, which was the complex just north of the DMZ, where you had more than 50,000 North Korean workers in factories owned and operated by South Korean businesses, North Korean workers did eventually have some voice. In fact, probably a great deal more voice than they did working in North Korean factories, government-owned factories. So it's not entirely true that they be captive workers. And in fact, this is an interesting kind of trajectory to explore. In other words, the radicalization of North Korean workers working in capitalism. In other words, capitalist firms owned by South Korea. I think South Korea imagines that economic cooperation will let 1,000 Kaesong industrial complexes bloom. That this is the way South Korean small and medium-sized enterprises can compete against not just China, but against all the places where Chinese capital is starting to move to, Vietnam and other places further in Southeast Asia. This is the only way South Korean small and medium-sized enterprises, I'm not talking about the chaebol, I'm talking about the huge enterprises, but the small and medium-sized enterprises can compete, and that is having access to North Korean workers.
Does anybody here cherish the hope of actual reunification of South and North, or is that so far-fetched that it would be dangerous to even talk about it as an aspiration?
They constantly talk about it. Kim Jong-un in his speech, his New Year's speech, talked about it. He mentioned it about almost a dozen times about how the Koreans have to work together among themselves, no outsiders, to move towards unification. It's always been there. There on both North and South. There are official committees. There's a Ministry of Unification in the South. That's kind of the dream. The problem, of course, is that there's obviously quite a bit of suspicion in terms of what Kim Jong-un would like to see as maybe boss of a unified Korea. Maybe the Southerners, South Koreans, may not have that same kind of view. And certainly in all of this, China is the key in terms of how to move forward and either allow or not allow unification. But if I could just go back to what John said, Moon Jae-in is already anticipating the possibilities in terms of economic cooperation. He's got a, quote, Presidential Committee on Northern Economic Cooperation. One of his talking points when he meets Putin in a few days in Moscow is to push the idea of more special economic zones, like Kaesong. I visited it from both the north and the south, that's one model that can be a modest.
I don't understand what it is. What is a Kaesong thing?
Kaesong, during the time of Kim Dae-jung, it was the great economic initiative where small South Korean companies would put money into an area just north of the demilitarized zone near the town of Kaesong, which has a long history in terms of even once upon a time, I believe, being the ancient capital of a unified Korea. But Kaesong, so money, private money from the south, married with workers from the north, producing shoes, producing clothes, producing small machinery. I still have a set of pots, steel pots that came from it as when it was opened. But then
wait a minute. This is I'm sorry to be dumb, but I never heard of it before. This is in North or South Korea?
In just north of the demilitarized zone in North Korea.
But it's part of the regular North Korean regime, or
yes.
was it like a Hong Kong, an enclave that more autonomous?
I wouldn't go as far as Hong Kong, but a special economic zone where again South Korean companies, small companies, could build factories and use cheaper labor, and of course, the usual thing. The South Koreans give hard currency to the North Koreans. The North Koreans then pay the North Korean labor with North Korean currency, but that's no big deal. They're still getting a heck of a lot better salary than they had. But this Kaesong was expanding. It was a fairly huge. They were even going to put in a golf course and really move forward because it looked like it was working. And then, of course, they got into a few political snits. It was closed and then reopened, and now it's closed again and has been for the last few years. But I understand there was a South Korean delegation there to take a look at what would be required to reopen it. Mm-hmm. So again, there's movement, there's planning, and hopefully that's an incentive for North Korea to continue on that kind of economic plane rather than firing off missiles and nuclear weapons.
Right. I expected this conversation to be more hard-nosed. I expected everybody to be a little bit cynical because that's what I'm reading in certainly in the press. But you guys sound a lot more, softer-nosed than I expected, and I've enjoyed it very much. Anybody have a final word before we say goodnight?
I'd like to add something. A friend of mine met Desmond Tutu at a peace conference in the Netherlands a number of years ago, and she thanked him for participating in the peace conference. And he took her by the hand and she said, Mary, when I was growing up in South Africa, I never dreamed that I would see an end to apartheid in my lifetime. And if we can abolish apartheid, we can abolish war.
All right. That's a pretty good slogan. I'll carve that on the wall. This has been great fun. It's been an honor, a real privilege to have this wonderful conversation with people who know what you're talking about. So I thank you, and I think I've had fun. So I'll see you one of these days. Thanks a lot, and good night.
Thank you. It's been great.